Hey, this is Pastor Jay Lee wishing you a happy new year from the Daily Sabbath podcast. Hey guys, Pastor Jay here. Welcome to the Daily Sabbath podcast. Hope you guys had an amazing week, and I'm glad that I can send you guys off into the weekend with another great interview. Now, a few weeks ago, I shared on Instagram and on the podcast sort of a preview of the different topics that we're planning to talk about this year on the podcast. And I mean, we've got an incredible list of topics, an incredible list of guests coming up. But, I just sort of threw them out there, and I kind of threw out the question on Instagram, hey, which topic are you the most excited to talk about? And by far the topic that people were the most excited about is the topic that we're talking about today, which is spiritual but not religious. I think increasingly more and more people are identifying themselves as being spiritual but not religious. And so last year I did a series of devotionals on the topic of being spiritual but not religious. And so there was a lot of response to that topic. And so I thought it was important for us to come back and address this in a little bit more long form way. And so this is a topic that we're going to revisit a few times this year. And the approach that I wanted to take was to interview some people who do or have in the past identified as spiritual but not religious, and to really just kind of hear their stories and hear from them. And I think a thesis that I have is that, somebody who identifies as spiritual but not religious, I think within that phrase, there's already sort of a critique, right? There's a critique there of the church or of Christianity, or maybe just a critique of organized religion in general. But I think there's always somewhat of a critique there. There's something there that they're not just running to, but they're pulling away from. I guess my thesis is that if we talk to people who identify as spiritual but not religious, that there's probably a lot that we can learn. Maybe some things that we as Christians or as the church are making mistakes in and maybe need to do better in. But also maybe there's some things that we'll learn that, really are completely out of our control. I don't know. But I think it's better for us not to just theorize, but actually talk to some people who identify as spiritual but not religious and try to hear it just straight from them and their own experience. And so my guest today in this first volume of Spiritual Not Religious interviews is Serena Sutterfield. She is the CEO of Life Between Weights, which is a business centered around whole life wellness. And within that, she has a life coaching program called Vertical First. She also hosts a podcast called Life Between Weights, as well as hosting some yoga and meditation classes. And so Serena graciously allowed me to interview her about a month ago. And I think there were a lot of great things in this interview that we can pick up on and learn from as the church and as Christians. But before we get to the interview, I wanted to take a second just to acknowledge a few people. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge one of our listeners. Her name is Doris, and she graciously has supported the podcast by buying me a few cups of coffee. And so I'm so thankful that you would support the podcast in this way. Really appreciate it. And I also wanted to acknowledge the people who have taken time to leave ratings and reviews for the podcast. Now, usually I can't see who you guys are, but I really appreciate those of you guys who have taken time to leave a rating. And for those of you guys who took time to leave a review, and just the reviews that you guys left are so kind and so gracious. And so I thank you guys so much from the bottom of my heart. And if there's anybody else who is listening to this, and if you are enjoying the podcast and are blessed by it, I humbly ask that you would take just a couple of seconds to leave me a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and just really help other people find the show as well. And so with that being said, here is my first interview in the Spiritual But Not Religious series with Serena Sutterfield. And so, Serena, thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest on the podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get started, I was just wondering if maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about Life Between Weights.
Yeah, so I started Life Between Weights about 4 years ago with the premise that there's just so much more that goes into our health and wellness than just changing the way that we eat and moving our body. It talks about how we have to go inside of ourselves and really find out who we are in order to make true and life-changing changes to our daily lives.
Okay, so it's body and health wellness, but it goes deeper than just the body. It goes deeper than just what you're eating or how much you're exercising, but really you're focusing on the total person.
Exactly, exactly. It's all about how we can develop our own personal realities through the things that we do on a daily basis.
And so, I'll definitely include in the episode description just links to Serena if you want to find out more, if you want to connect with her. But so let's get into this topic of being spiritual but not religious. And so, Serena, in my conversations with you, you said that you started with a faith background. And so I was wondering if you could just maybe start there, like, and tell us just a little bit about your background in church or in organized religion.
Yeah, sure. So, as a young person, a young teenager, I went to church with my like aunts, uncles, cousins. My mom and dad didn't go to church with us, and I remember a van with driven by our youth group pastor would drive around, and I mean, like in a 30-minute radius around the church, going around and picking everybody up and making sure that everybody got to church okay. And that was really
That,
cool
that, yeah, that's
for this
awesome.
person to do that. Took their own time and all that. So that was awesome, and I appreciated that. So because my parents didn't go, so they didn't drive us, so we did that. We went on Sunday mornings. They picked us up on Wednesday evenings. I went to church on Friday nights. So I was always at church as a young person. And I think that I went and I believed in God because the people around me did. The people I looked up
Hmm.
to the most in my life, my family members, and then we made friends and all that in the church too. But I didn't really have like a good experience in the youth group. I mean, we were all a bunch of 15-year-old boys and girls who thought we knew what the world was all about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then also be going from the youth group where I was having maybe some adverse experiences and then sitting in like different sermons really weren't making sense to me conceptually. I just wasn't really understanding really what was being taught, and that kind of really turned me off of organized religion. And it wasn't a hard decision to leave when like I thought I grew up and just knew better, and I
Hmm.
stopped going to church for those reasons, just because it was a little bit difficult and I didn't
Hmm.
understand a lot of what was happening inside of the church.
So when you say that you didn't really understand like the messages, didn't understand what was happening in the church, do you mean like you didn't agree with it, or it was like, no, I literally just did not understand how any of this was relevant to life?
Well, a little bit of both. So
Hmm.
I have ADHD, and so I feel like that makes it a little bit more difficult for me to understand certain concepts. The way that they are presented to, like, I guess, normal, for lack of a better word, regular people. So that did make it a little bit different for me. But really, just the overall message and just the way it made me feel about myself being in church was what I didn't agree with.
Hmm. That's really interesting to hear you say that the way that it made you feel is something that kind of led you to think, this is something that seems off, or this is something that I don't feel like agree with. And so could you kind of like maybe share a little bit more of like, what were those feelings that it was making you feel, or what were some things that you were hearing that were making you feel this certain way where you felt like, I don't, kind of started to push away from it?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of it was really that I understand that we are sinners as people. We are sinners. We are born into this world and we have the free will and we have to make these conscious decisions. So I understand that concept, but sitting in church, instead of it being a message of love, the pastor would shout about how love is the most important, but I'd always
Hmm.
leave feeling like I was dirty and gross, because they
Hmm.
talk about you need redemption, you are filth, you live in the muck and the darkness, and you are no good.
Hmm.
So it was
Yeah.
kind of like it felt like they were talking out of both sides of their mouth.
Hmm.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, that's really interesting. So it's not that there wasn't talk about love. and God being love and love being central. I mean, they were talking about those things,
Mm-hmm.
but the message that was coming across and what you were feeling coming out of that was still this feeling of condemnation and guilt and
Yeah.
shame.
Yeah, that's right. And so I didn't understand why I had to feel those things that you were saying, the condemnation and the guilt and the shame from our God who loved us so much that he did, all these wonderful things up to, his ultimate sacrifice for us, that is such an act of love. And I
Hmm.
understand that, but it didn't feel like that at church.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's definitely this aspect of kind of the message itself and the feeling
Mm-hmm.
that you're getting from the message. One thing that I'm kind of curious about is, as you know, some of these dynamics, these relational dynamics, and also just kind of the dynamics of maybe disagreeing with, not disagreeing, but hearing one thing but feeling another, in terms of the message that was coming from the church. Because it's one thing to have like a certain feeling about the people at the church, and then it's another what your feelings were about Jesus or about God. And sometimes those, can combine, right? They affect one another. But I'm just kind of curious, as you were beginning to sort of push away from the church and some of the relationships at the church, what was the status of your feelings about God and your relationship with Jesus? How was that affected by all of this?
Well, like I said before, I knew in my heart of hearts that this is the truth, that we do serve a loving God and that he did make a sacrifice for us. And so I always knew that, but it was kind of something that I just put in my back pocket for a while,
Mm-hmm.
because while like I knew it because I was taught it at a young age, it didn't really feel real to me
Mm-hmm.
because the pastors would always talk about being able to like live it out and see it out and work it out in your own life,
Mm-hmm.
and it just wasn't happening for me. So like I know and I knew, but I kind of just put God away for a little while once I left the church.
Mm-hmm. And so, was there kind of like that moment of clear breaking away from the church? And if so, like when exactly was that?
So I was about 17 years old when I decided to stop going to church.
Okay. And so it was kind of like, was there was sort of a moment where you just decided, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore? Or was it just sort of the slow drift where one day it was,
Yeah. So like I said, we had that van that came around all the time, and it was easy enough to say, you know what, don't come here. You don't have to come pick me up today. I'm not going to go or whatever. And it was easy to say it once, and I didn't really feel guilty for not going the one time. So it was easier to not go the next time,
mm-hmm.
and so forth until the driver stopped calling and saying, do you want me to pick
Mm-hmm.
you up today?
Yeah. So after you decided to, basically stop going to church, just kind of curious, what was then sort of, what was your spirituality like in that period of time? Like, did you go through a phase where it's like, I don't even really know if I believe in any of this stuff? Or did you still kind of feel like, no, I'm still a spiritual person, but I'm just not sure I'm down with this church stuff anymore? Like, kind of, could you describe to me sort of that period away from church?
Right, right. Yeah, it was more along the lines of after I left the church at that age. Again, I was 17. By the time I was 18, I was ready to move out of my parents' house, and I had just left, and I did not like try to practice my faith at all for a long time
Mm-hmm.
after that.
Yeah. How
And
about
again,
how
it
long would you
was
say was that
about
period?
how long?
Yeah.
Almost a decade,
Oh, okay. Yeah. A long
probably
time.
8 years,
Uh-huh.
a long time.
Yeah. Okay. And so then, I guess during that decade, that 8 years where you really were not going to church for sure, and then also really not connecting with your faith too much. Yeah. Is it that period that you would consider yourself to be spiritual but not religious? Or maybe during that period you didn't even consider yourself to be spiritual? Like, what was the sort of the status of that, your spirituality during that decade?
During that period, I was just doing whatever I wanted to do. I was living so much in my body, so much in my flesh, that the thought of what is going to happen to me never crossed my mind. To be completely honest with you, because I was just too interested in, living what I thought was what living meant, having experiences and just doing different things that I did not consider my spirituality at all until a couple years ago.
Okay, so it was just it just wasn't really even a thought, and you just kind of went about living your life and just trying to live to the fullest, I imagine. And maybe, I don't know, like if you would say this was true, but did you have a feeling of sort of like, yeah, I'm free now, like I'm untethered from any kind of religious, rule or binding, like I'm not worried about that. I'm just going to worry about doing me and living my life.
Yeah, so I would like to say that that's true, but I think that looking back, and that might have been how I was thinking back then, but looking back on it now, of like different decisions that I would make either to or not to do something, was definitely guided. I mean, it's a blessing that I'm here today to be able to do what I do today, that I would have been called back.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so
that I still felt guided. But it wasn't how I was thinking about it in the time. Like looking back, hindsight, I can see all the different ways that I was protected over that decade.
Yeah, it's funny how that works, where sometimes when you're experiencing it, you don't see it, but when you look back, then you can be like, oh, God was doing an awful lot. I just didn't see it. So, yeah, I mean, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit, could you share a little bit of that journey of that kind of that 8 years where you're sort of maybe in sort of a wandering period, and you're not really actively thinking about God, but in hindsight now you can see there are different ways where he guided you, protected you, was slowly sort of drawing you in and drawing you back?
For sure. And that question made me smile. So by the time I was 20 years old, I had my first daughter. She will be 16 soon. She's amazing.
Oh, wow. 16.
So I was 20 years old. I was very young. And so I was married. And so that was with my first husband. I had her, and it was not like a healthy relationship at all. It was more like we were friends who just hung out all the time. And then we had a kid, and then his parents made us get married.
Yeah. Totally understand. Yeah.
And we weren't married for long. And there was some things that that he and I had gone through, periods of time where there was just issues that we needed to work out. And ultimately, I just knew that this was not the life that I wanted our daughter to live. And so I just picked myself up out of that situation and went home. I didn't know what else to do. I took my kid and I went back home. I lived in my parents' house while I was working and taking care of my daughter. And then it wasn't too long after that. It was about a year that I was working and taking care of her on my own that I met my current husband. And he and I, we just had our 12th wedding anniversary.
Oh, nice.
And,
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And he was not a believer when we first got together. So there would be times where like I knew, okay, now I'm having kids, we're settling down, we're married now, we have a house now, and I need to do the things that grown-ups do. So, I would try to get my husband to go to church with me. I'd make sure that my kids were going to church. I made sure my kids knew Jesus and all of this. But it still felt very like lukewarm to me. It felt more like this was my responsibility as an adult than my responsibility as a human. That was, and my responsibility as God's likeness. It was more of like another thing to check off of my list. And then in 2016, my husband and I had, it was a traumatic year. The end of 2015, my cousin, my husband's best friend, had an accident and passed away at a very young age. And so that through like the entirety of 2016, being faced with our own mortality,
Yeah.
and just really, frankly, how shitty life can be
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. I literally hit my knees every day in 2016. And by the end of that year, not only was my own faith renewed,
Mm.
but my husband had committed his life to Christ as well.
Wow.
And my oldest daughter all three of us were baptized that year.
Oh, wow. And so, I mean, it kind of really, the catalyst was this tragedy.
Yeah, it really was. Because I didn't have the strength of my own to go through it. I knew that I needed something outside of myself to help get us through this circumstance that was happening.
And so, yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of curious because I think from the outside looking in, usually people think, yeah, when hardship comes, it's so unfair for God to expect people to have faith and also experience, these hardships and this suffering. But I mean, one of the weird things about life is that a lot of times it's the hardships and the suffering that end up being the catalysts
Yeah.
to kind of bring us to faith. And it's just one of those weird kind of counterintuitive sort of things. And so I'm just kind of curious about you and your journey in that, where you have this tragedy, this horrible tragedy that happens, and it drives you into, like you said, praying every single day for that year. I mean, I'm just kind of curious of the journey of that. So obviously you said that you were looking for just strength that you knew that you didn't have. Was it also kind of like an angry thing? Was it like a God, what the heck? Like what's up? Like where are you at? Like I'm just kind of curious what that process of that year was.
Yeah, and I think like it's a very Hollywood thing for people to shake their fists at heaven,
Mm-hmm.
and I did not come to this from an anger standpoint. I did hold anger inside of myself over the situation that was happening, but I don't think that at any point I pointed at God and said, how could you let this happen inside of my life?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I know that everything that happens in our daily life, is a culmination of choices that we make.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's not God's fault, so it was pure strength and direction that I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what each day was going to look like. And so I needed that support system,
Mm-hmm.
that heavenly support system, even to be able to make sure, because at this time our youngest was born in 2010, so she was 6 years old at this time. So I had a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 10-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are very young kids to have to take care of while you are in just this horrible headspace for yourself.
Yeah.
And so it was definitely the strength of God that I was relying so heavily on every day.
Mm-hmm. And so obviously, I mean, this praying was doing something, because you said by the end of that year, your faith had been renewed. Your husband put his faith in Jesus. And so I'm just kind of curious, if there's anything more that you can tell us about, like, I mean, obviously you were, daily just on your knees, but like, is there any more you can tell us about what happened during that year that really kind of opened you guys up and resulted in that? Were there any particular moments or events?
I don't know that if it was necessarily a culmination of events as much as it was that because I was in the Word every day and for strength and not falling apart,
Mm-hmm.
I think is what made my husband look a little bit harder and say, "What are you doing?"
Mm-hmm.
Because I am falling apart.
I see.
And I really think that just because, I mean, you as a pastor, I imagine you know, and you talk about how just applicable the Bible, the word, the living word is to our lives today as it was, 2,000 years ago,
Hmm.
that we can go through with whatever problems and situations and circumstances in our lives. And there is scripture to help you through it, to guide you through it. So in particular, it was James that really brought me through studying his book about perseverance and all of that, and just spiritual maturity. And I
Hmm.
think that my husband saw that in me and was like, I need some of that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's so powerful to hear you say that, because, I mean, obviously as Christians, even as pastors, we say that, we believe that the word of God, right, the scriptures are powerful
Mm-hmm.
to transform a person and to sustain a person. But sometimes I think maybe we don't truly believe that, which is why, maybe we end up trying to do other things and manipulate it more.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to hear you say that, kind of in one of the darkest places in your life, the difference was really just being on your knees in prayer every day and reading the book of James, right? Like, so simple, but that really was the difference maker.
It really was. It was so simple. I read a proverb a day.
Hmm.
I made sure, that spiritual milk, and just to gain that perseverance and maturity.
Hmm. So that's about 4 or 5 years ago. And so now, kind of projecting forward 4 or 5 years to today, what would you say then is now like sort of, would you still consider yourself to be spiritual but not religious? Or is that something that you feel like you've left behind? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I feel like I consider myself a child of the light. To say that I identify as a spiritual person, I think would be misleading, in that, because I feel like people who are spiritual leave Jesus out of it altogether a lot of the times, and kind of make it just more of a nice story to tell themselves. And so I still have the heavy conviction of the written word. And so, as far as like identifying as spiritual instead of religious, I would say that I really feel as if I have stepped into this light,
Hmm.
the light of God, the light, and that how it just vanquishes and exposes the darkness. I feel like God has given me the ability now to see, like he's just turned the lights on for me.
Hmm.
And it's a little bit harder. I wouldn't say religious at all. When I think religious, I think rules and rigidity and that inflexibility.
Hmm.
And I feel like that was my initial issue with the church in the first place.
Yeah. So you're still a little bit hesitant about the word religious because that's what you associate religious with, but you wouldn't want people to think that I'm just a spiritualist. Like, it's not ambiguous. You are a follower of Jesus. You have stepped into that. You embrace the scriptures as being the word of
Mm-hmm.
God. So you wouldn't want people to think that it's just sort of this kind of ambiguous spirituality that maybe a lot of people practice.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't want people to think that just because I feel like I am more of a spiritual person because I focus on the relational aspect with Christ, that I don't have, like, I feel like when you tell somebody that you're spiritual, that they think that you talk to universe with a capital U.
Yeah, the universe, right?
Yeah, and that's just not true
Hmm.
for me.
Gotcha.
I, serve the God who created the
Hmm.
universe.
Yeah, and I mean, I actually wasn't really planning on talking about this, but just kind of what you're saying here about sort of like the universe and things like that, and the way that people might perceive what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
But like, let's say somebody who follows your account, right? And I think one of the things that you practice is like yoga and things like that, right? Where
Yeah.
people, maybe some Christians on the outside looking in might think, oh, is she a Christian, or, is she kind of like, one of these like more kind of new agers, and, the universe, and, she's doing yoga and all these things. Right. And so I don't know, like, do you kind of come across that sort of sentiment from people?
I have only come across that one time. One time a lady came into my inbox completely unprompted to tell me that because I practice yoga, that means that I do not have God living in my heart.
So just very direct.
Oh, yes. No, it was very direct. She was like, you are going to hell because you do yoga. She's like, do you know that doing yoga is like chanting to other gods? I was like, do you know that you are 100% incorrect?
Yeah. Maybe you should go to one of my yoga classes before you make that statement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and on that note, I believe that each person's like different convictions that they have throughout their life, whether somebody wants to do yoga or thinks that yoga is unsafe, that's something that God puts on each of our individual hearts and consciousness.
Yeah. So you don't hold it against somebody else who maybe feels like they shouldn't do yoga, and you don't hold that against them, but right. Okay. And so, I mean, maybe just to kind of, and maybe talking about Christians and yoga could be a whole nother episode.
Yeah, for sure.
But, I'm just kind of curious because, before, when you were younger, when you left the church, you said that, one of the tensions for you was sort of, even though the church did talk about love and God is love and all that stuff, the feeling that you got was more of a feeling of condemnation and guilt and shame. And so now that you've kind of come full circle on this journey and you are back kind of, I assume, right, that you guys are back within the church or a church. Is that right?
We have a church that we go to that we really love. We've got tons of friends there. The pastor is great. We love everybody. And I don't hold issue with the church, but I don't necessarily feel drawn to go back.
Okay. So you wouldn't say that you've fully come circle and now I'm back in the church.
Right. I feel like I have come full circle on my faith and my understanding of the nature of God. Like, I understand the love part now as to where, like I said, didn't get it before because it was more authoritarian than it was like that loving, compassionate father.
Yeah. Okay. So
that we're taught about.
So I'm really curious about that then. So, because you said you do have a church that you guys go to sometimes and that you like and you enjoy, but you wouldn't say that you have come back to the church. And so I'm kind of curious to know, what are some of your current thoughts about the church itself, and kind of why you're hesitant to say, even though you do go sometimes, why you're hesitant to say that you really belong to the church, and just any feelings that you have about that kind of now today.
Yeah, so the feelings that I have about that are that I just really, I feel like we get a lot of overview of what different biblical concepts and different biblical stories, like, the church will go through Genesis to Revelation through the year or whatever and teach on all of that. So we get all like the bullet points, but I do feel like it's only bullet points. I don't feel like, and I've gone to a massive amounts of churches and different churches, and I never have really felt like, but here's how to do the things I'm telling you to do. Here are some actionable steps that you can take in order to do these things. So, and to illustrate this point, there is a strong song on the Christian radio on Amazon Music called Truth Be Told by Matthew West. And it talks about how to the world we present one face, but to ourselves and behind closed doors, we have like the mask comes off and our true selves live at home behind closed doors. While we present our faith in a positive way to the world, but we don't live it out behind closed doors. And about how a lot of Christians still struggle with these feelings of unworthiness, of not being enough, of inadequacy, of being unlovable, of all of these like negative thoughts and traits and characteristics that we apply to ourselves, these are things that people are having a hard time letting go of.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't, and people at church will tell you, oh, well, I'll pray for you.
Mm.
Okay, great. But how am I going to help? Like, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, I feel like there's no real answer. And if I were somebody if you were to say, okay, well, Serena, what are some actionable steps then? I would tell you that to step back and to be an observer of your own mind and to really understand where the thoughts in your head come from, to figure out how these thoughts make you feel. Because Jesus says you are to capture your thoughts and to give them to God. We're told to do this in the Bible, but we aren't told how to do that in the church. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like there's a whole lot of, well, you're no good kind of thing going on.
And do you still feel that even with the church that you said that you kind of go to sometimes and enjoy, but you feel like it's still pretty much that?
I do. And I don't think I realized it until recently, because I do really so much enjoy this particular church. Our pastor is great. He's super friendly and funny, and he's got lots of like anecdotes, and he'll make you chuckle and talks about college football and his Southern charm and all, because I live in South Carolina. But you get a story, and this is how I used to used to feel, and this is how I feel now. And then, now I'm all better. But like I said, I just don't feel like there's a whole lot of direction.
Okay. So I think what I'm hearing is that even though you can enjoy a service, at this time, you don't necessarily see being a part of the church as being essential. And one of the reasons being that you feel like maybe it's not super practical, that a lot of times what you get coming from the church is maybe kind of superficial, and people are not getting what they really need to be able to be free or to heal or to move forward in their lives. Would you say that is kind of a good summary?
Yes, that is a very good summary. Okay. We're told to leave our past behind, that Jesus has forgiven us of all of our sins. You can leave your past in the past. You can just leave it there. He doesn't care about that anymore. It has no bearing on your life now. But really, when these big old monsters live inside of my head, how are you supposed to leave them behind?
So not just I can be forgiven, but now how do I walk out in that new freedom?
Exactly. Becoming the new creature. We are new creatures in Christ, but we are just told we are new creatures. And I don't feel like we are told how this transformation takes place.
Okay. And so then here's my question to you, like just kind of probing a little bit on what your true feelings are about this. Like, do you feel like being a part of the church is not essential because you just really have not found a church that truly kind of embodies what you're talking about, or what you feel like the church should be? Or is it that you just don't think, even if there was a church that was doing well at this, I still just kind of see the church as being sort of an optional, kind of nice to have, but it's not really like an important part of my faith?
Well, I really do think that fellowship is the most important part of anybody's faith. Being able to have, this group of like-minded people together to support and lift each other up is extremely important. I do believe that having a church that you go to is also very important. To be able to walk into the house of God walking into a house even that has God is like a breath of fresh air. I do think that is really important. I just think that right now there are certain people that are meant to hear what this particular pastor has to say, like the way that he says it. There are certain people in this world, all over the world, because he pastors online and everything. He's on YouTube because of the whole pandemic thing. But, so people all over the world watch this guy, and that's great. And I'm sure he's changing and touching thousands of hearts, and as I'm sure you are as well. And I feel like there are certain people who are meant to hear this message in certain ways. And I think that there are certain people set out for each person to hear the message to receive it the way that the person puts it out there. Does that make sense? So I believe the church is important. I believe it's important for the people who find refuge in the church.
But you don't necessarily think that it's something that is like maybe if you've already found refuge, or you feel like maybe like you were saying, fellowship is really important. Like maybe, I don't know, for you, if you feel like you have found that kind of fellowship outside of the church, and so you don't maybe necessarily need a church to provide that for you. Would you say that's kind of where you're at?
I would say so. I think what you and I are doing right now is like church. Basically,
the church is good, the place that some people are at in terms of the message that they need to hear, or maybe they don't have that community that they can have fellowship with, and so the church can kind of help them enter into that community. But then also at the same time, you sort of have this critique where it's like, but most churches are maybe not fostering true fellowship or true community in a way that that people really need.
Yes. Yeah. So I feel like if there was one thing that I would maybe add, because my church has got lots of like extracurricular activity, like they do pottery classes and all kinds of stuff. There's all sorts of things you can do all week long. So if I were to go back into the church, I would talk about maybe the different ways that we can kind of focus on, well, let me help you like with kind of like mindset, help with like actionable steps, kind of coaching people through like having these difficult feelings that we have to deal with, and maybe being able to like put some sort of program or workshop together, I think would be a perfect complement to a church that might make it more effective.
Well, it sounds like maybe you should start one. Sounds like a perfect ministry for you. Okay, so the last question I want to ask you, obviously we've been talking about you and your journey and kind of your perspective, but I want to ask you to kind of maybe project out to other people. Why do you think so many people identify as spiritual but not religious? And what do you think most of those people mean? Obviously everybody's different, but like what do you think people mean when they say they're spiritual but not religious, and why do they identify in that way?
That's a really good question, and I had a lot of fun answering this one. I believe that people identify as being spiritual rather than religious a lot of times because if people have a bad experience in the church, they'll just leave the church and then that's that. And that's it. They never go back. They never reconsider and all of that. And that's really sad. But the spiritual aspect of it, I feel like because our souls are searching, and our souls will always be searching. We have these God-shaped holes inside of this space of greater thinking beyond what we can see or things that are tangible that we can touch. We're always looking for a sense of purpose, meaning, belonging. What does it all mean? Our very beings, like right down to the fiber of what we are made out of, know that there is something more, and it searches for something to fill that void and drives us to find it anywhere. So some people will turn to like flesh-seeking activities, like maybe drinking or partying or buying things or whatever it is that makes you feel better, maybe makes you feel better for a minute, makes that hole feel a little bit smaller. And some people fill it with this spirituality. They fill it with the universe. But many of us can't subscribe to religion because our spirit is seeking freedom and not restraint. Religion, with the rigidity and with the rules, while the message is a message of freedom, religion in and of itself feels like a restraint, feels like bondage, while our souls are seeking that freedom. And that they seek to be liberated. Our spirits, they seek to be liberated, to be set free in things like peace and love and joy and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control. We look for that everywhere, whether we know it or not. And I believe that's what this spirituality is. We're looking for a greater sense of purpose beyond our own self.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, because, I think there's some there's some Christians who maybe they hear of people identifying as spiritual but not religious, and they're very upset by that, and they're very like, oh man, the world, look at what the world is going to, right? Whereas I think what I hear you saying, which I think is a great point, is that we should actually see that as a sign of hope, that people, maybe they have a bad experience with church and they're done with church, but they don't walk away from the spiritual part. That there's still something inside of people that is longing and searching and has a sense that there's something more that I want and I need. And we should actually see that as a great sign of hope, that even as people are trying to are rejecting the church, that they can't reject that need for God. Yeah.
It's ingrained.
And the other thing I think I hear you saying here that I think is a great insight, which is maybe, I guess, a theme of what you've been saying throughout this entire interview, is that the church needs to be better at showing people why the gospel is a source of freedom. Because the perception is that it's a source of restraint and a source of rules. And so we need to be better at showing people how, because I mean, it is true, right? I mean, we wouldn't want to go the other way and say, oh yeah, I mean, you're free in Christ, do whatever you want. Like, no, I mean, there are things that are not helpful, and there are things that are not pleasing to God that will hurt you. But to be able to maybe more skillfully explain to people how, even within the boundaries, or maybe boundaries is a bad word. I need more skill in this. Like even within the sort of the framework of God's word, the scope of God's will, how that's actually greater freedom than what they might have apart from God.
And it really is. And you know what? And a common, occurring thing throughout, like, my different daily meditation and Bible study is about how people we're constantly seeking, as Christians, the will of God for our lives, as we should. But I feel like a lot of times we are missing it so completely because we are looking for the parted waters. We're looking for these very big things. We're looking for our Goliath. These very physical things that we can see with our eyes. We're looking for people to come at us with stones, when really that's not how it's going to happen. It's happening inside of our minds. We have to be able to have that self-control and sound mind in order to truly liberate the body from this world.
Well, I mean, right, Romans says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so that, yes. So that is kind of a big emphasis for you in your work and in your ministry, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I can't remember where I read it, but I had just read that the will of God for all of our lives is for us to live like Christ. And if we live like Christ, we're living in peace and love and joy, the fruit of the Spirit, which is liberating. It is liberating us from these feelings of the unworthiness, the not being lovable, the not being good enough, and all of that. All of these, like I referred to as monsters in our heads earlier, that's what we need to be freed from. Yeah. And living like Christ does that, has that freedom in our mind.
All right, so there it is. I want to thank again my guest, Serena Sutterfield. Again, if you would like to connect more with Serena, the name of her podcast is Life Between Weights. She also has a one-on-one life coaching program called Vertical First. You can also find her on Instagram and Facebook. And so I'll include links in the episode description just for all of that stuff if you want to connect with her. But as we wrap up, I wanted to key in on a few things that came up during the interview. The first was the part where Serena talked about how, even though growing up in the church, they talked about the love of Jesus and grace and forgiveness. The feeling that she came away with was one of condemnation and guilt and shame. And I think there's something there for us to think about as Christians and in the church, that sometimes, even though we might be using the right words, be using the right language in talking about the love of God and the grace that is available to us through Christ. But sometimes maybe the feeling that we convey and the cultures that we're creating in the church sometimes could maybe feel still more condemning and more focused on our guilt rather than God's grace. And maybe even though the language might be there, the care and the culture are not. And so I just thought that was something that maybe was worth at least thinking about. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention from the interview, which was to me the most moving part of the interview, which is kind of what ultimately brought Serena back into the fold of Christian faith. Not just being sort of like this independent spiritual person, but really coming back into the fold. And like she said, at the end of the day, it really just came down to getting into the scriptures, like reading the Bible and praying. There really was no magical formula. It was just the basics. Reading the Bible and allowing Jesus to speak to her through it, and just getting on her hands and knees and crying out to him in prayer. And so for me, I think it was just encouraging to hear that. The scriptures and prayer are still powerful. That's still enough to transform a person. I think sometimes we just maybe overcomplicate things. That at the end of the day, what people really need from us is for us to really love Jesus, to be people who exemplify grace and love and faith and hope, who will ultimately both embody the scriptures, but also actually lead them into the scriptures and talking to God through prayer. And that is enough for lives to be transformed still today. And so that's something that I'm taking away from this interview. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this. If you guys have any comments or questions for me or Serena, feel free to leave a message on our pod inbox. I'll leave a link in the episode description, and I'll be happy to respond to you. I'll probably even use it on the show. So if you just want to hear your voice on the podcast, leave me a message, leave me a question, and I'll be happy to respond. All right, so that's it for this week. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care. If you're enjoying the podcast and you would like to support us, you can leave us a rating and review at Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can buy Pastor Jay a cup of coffee. If you would like to contact Pastor Jay, visit dailysabbath.com or our Instagram @dailysabbath.